AI as a feature as opposed to AI as a product is the way to go. And I think a big part of, I think over the long term, that will become more and more true because the AI as a product companies will become increasingly, if they aren't already, like a utility,
Yep.
like cloud compute. You can switch from AWS to GCP or Azure. There's some headaches associated with making those changes, but you can do it. And in the same kind of way, if I right now, there's production reasons why I'm calling the OpenAI API, but I actually, in my personal life, find that using Anthropic's Claude, for most use cases that I have, far exceeds the performance, the capabilities relative to what I'm getting from the GPT experience over at OpenAI. And so, I'm looking now to be switching, even in production purposes, from the OpenAI API over to Anthropic. And it's this constant battle, and they're also constantly battling on price. They're with the Claude 3.5 release, 3.5 Sonnet, that outperforms seemingly on most capabilities you would want at half the price and twice the speed relative to their Claude 3.0 model, Claude 3.0 Opus. And so, yeah, it's like a utility. It becomes easy to switch. Lots of people who are providing AI as a feature, even huge players like Apple with their Apple Intelligence, they are going to be calling on, in some instances, with your permission, they're going to go out to the OpenAI API. And so, I mean, that shows if a company like Apple, if it isn't worthwhile for them to be developing frontier models in-house as one of the most valuable companies on the planet, $3 trillion in market capitalization, and they're better off using a third-party service, even though that probably there's people in there shaking their heads at like the privacy implications of that. It goes to show you that trying to compete on that front is going to be very expensive and very hard.
Yep. Yeah. A few companies can do AI as a product, you can say. I mean, OpenAI is an example of maybe the first one, or one of the first ones that basically took a model and sold access to a model without a lot more. But we're seeing even with OpenAI and Anthropic, they are moving away from purely AI as a product. As you mentioned, recently Anthropic came up with artifacts, which is a nice quality of life feature. We've seen a lot of features going to ChatGPT outside the API, things like memories that you can add it directly. So they are, I think, learning along the way the UI and UX to make it more useful for people, while also being one of the relatively few companies that are trying to develop AI to sell in the same way that there are a few cloud providers that sell compute.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suspect also a lot of those features, just as you were saying it there, I suspect a lot, these companies like, having that history feature, having, in the example of Google Gemini, which is another one of the few people operating at the frontier with developing frontier models and providing access to these LLMs as a service. One of the things that Gemini has done is they've created these gems, which are like personas for different tasks. So, I could have one. I don't actually have this as one. It would be maybe a good idea for me to do this, is to have a gem for converting the transcript of a podcast episode into a good social media post. And then I don't have to remember or look back through my prompts to find a great prompt where I did that last week or last month. And I can just be like, okay, there's my gem, pop it in. And so those kinds of features, like that gem, like history in ChatGPT, not only do they mean that these providers are moving away from AI as a product towards AI as a feature within a broader product ecosystem, but simultaneously, these are sticky features because once I have all that history with ChatGPT and it's kind of learned my preferences, I don't want to have to start over with Claude and do that.
Yeah, for sure. That's one of the things I suppose that in 2023, even today to some extent, these three companies, GPT-4, they're all kind of around the GPT-4 level. With Claude and Gemini and OpenAI, they are very close in functionality. Some of them are a little bit better at something or something else. But as a user, it's pretty easy to jump between them. So that point about stickiness is interesting. And speaking of gems, it reminded me of something I consider interesting. So similarly, OpenAI has a GPT store where you can have customized ChatGPTs. And people forget, I think, that this kind of thing started with Google with their Lambda project. So they internally had this tool where you could take a chatbot that was an LLM optimized for chatting and create variations of it. And then what happened was this person, Blake Lemoine, I forget, claimed that it was sentient in a Washington Post interview. And there was a whole bunch of media and drama. And I think that's part of why Google is seen by some people as being a late mover. It's interesting to think what history might have been like if they didn't have that kind of PR problem. Because that happened in May 2022, and then ChatGPT launched November 2022. And I bring this up only because I think this is an interesting bit of history of AI.
Yeah, it's one of those what they call sliding doors moments or closing doors moments. It's like what's the film called? Sliding doors? I don't know. They call it sliding door moments where
one of us do.
Yeah, it's where the idea, there's this whole movie where in one way the movie plays out, somebody gets on a train and they meet somebody. It ends up being like their partner for the rest of their life, whatever. In another version, they don't get on the train. The doors close just before they get on, and they live this entire alternative. And the movie kind of plays out those two vastly different lifestyles that played out based on making it on the train just on time or not making it on the train just on time. And so, the sliding doors closing. And so, so it is interesting that, it's that Blake Lemoine is an interesting character in kind of one of these. It's like, did Blake Lemoine, have this religious experience and make a big fuss about sentience or not? And what impact would that have had on Google capitalizing on making public technology that it had? I think that it is interesting that we're at this point where you and I both, I think, see, while Gemini, Anthropic, Gemini, I may as well say the companies and the products, Google Gemini, Anthropic's Claude, and OpenAI ChatGPT, their frontier model within each of those families is roughly the same for most use cases, and there might be some, like you said, where one is better for some particular application or another. But of those three, it seems like Google Gemini is the laggard. That's the one. I have subscriptions to all three, and I'm least likely to go to that one. There's the fewest use cases. Real-time web search is one where I'm kind of more likely to use it there because it capitalizes on Google search. Bing search is not the same as a Google search. And so when you do, an OpenAI search and with that, and I think Claude still at this time doesn't do real-time searches. So
yeah, and that's an interesting point we just covered when we recorded yesterday, the newest episode of Last Week in AI, that Gemini, they are launching it as a feature kind of across the product. So they launched it in Gmail. There's going to be a new button in the top right, and I saw this yesterday using Gmail, that there's a Gemini button. And if you're using Google Documents, Google Slides, that is also in there. And Microsoft has done this as well for Office Suite. They have integrated AI. So I think it's true that Gemini, the chatbot, is maybe not ideal, but for most people, it might not matter exactly which one is the best. And Gemini is cheaper. At least you get a 2-month free trial if you are a Gmail user, which I made use of. And really, I think there is an ecosystem thing of like if you're in the Google ecosystem and you use Gmail and you use Google Docs as I do, then you will use that chatbot just because there's less friction. If you're in Microsoft world, if you're in Apple world, yeah.
Yeah, and minimizing friction is the key, because as you see from website visits to, say, ChatGPT around November 2022, and then again with the GPT-4 release in March 2023, you had these huge spikes in interest in that particular interface that have since subsided. And so that kind of fits this overused Gartner hype cycle where you have like the peak hype and then the trough of disillusionment that follows. In that trough of disillusionment, you're probably less likely to be just going to one of these interfaces like ChatGPT to have a conversation for fun, because you've worn that through. It's not like a fun thing anymore. I wrote in a Waymo for the first time in my life yesterday, and that's amazing and completely mind-blowing for a few minutes.
I agree. That's how I felt.
And then, I know that you're a regular Waymo user. I hear you talking about it. You've been talking about it on the Last Week in AI podcast for months. I'm sure it's not something now when you get into a Waymo, you're probably not phoning your grandmother on a video call and showing her what it's like I did yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what happens when, like, Waymo as an example is interesting because they just recently opened it up to everyone in San Francisco. So now everyone can try it. And as you try things, it's, I guess, they become less magical and become normal. It's kind of funny, I think, for a lot of people in AI, this idea of large language models has been around since 2020, right? We had research papers, we had the OpenAI playground, in which you could already see to some extent the kinds of things you can use ChatGPT for. And that wasn't ChatGPT, but it was GPT-3 and then GPT 3.5. And there were a lot of papers where they used it for these kinds of things. And then ChatGPT hit, and everyone else realized this thing. And as someone who, like, in a way, knew already about large language models and the scaling laws and all of these things, you sort of didn't realize how, or I didn't realize at least, how profound it will be in a couple of years when everyone sees and uses it. And yeah, I still have my mind blown pretty regularly, like most recently text to songs.
Udio.
Yeah, Udio.
Lost myself in there for a while after you guys, because you guys started doing theme songs. Well, you had one episode that started with a theme song created by Udio.
Yeah.
And then I guess even that gimmick kind of wears off a little quickly even for you then, and now you have an ending song, which is something I keep meaning to implement on the Super Data Science podcast, because it's really fun because you create that ending song based on what happened in the episode.
Yeah, and it is a lot of fun. I think that's a application of these things that makes sense as sort of a fun little thing to include as part of a larger project or thing. Now that you mentioned it, I'm starting to wonder if we should do little songs like in section transitions, because it is a lot of fun. And those, you can make a 1-minute song.
Yeah.
And I have done it now a few times, and I find it quite fun.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of thing though that over time, I think if you had a 1-minute song transition between sections, I think that would probably get old for people after pretty quickly.
Exactly.
If it's like a 5-second transition, then that probably makes sense. People will like tolerate it. But I think that probably fits into this whole conversation of Waymo, of state-of-the-art text-to-text LLMs. This fits perfectly into this idea, which I guess I'm now going to get back to, which is that AI as a product rarely works, which is the quote that you had earlier. But AI as a feature does work well. And so, as you're saying, with something like now having Gemini in your Google Office suite in Gmail, that makes a huge amount of sense. And so it doesn't really matter if they're the third best frontier model, because that third best frontier model is still very, very good. It's 99.5% of the way kind of on any given capability relative to Claude and to ChatGPT. And so if I can just have, in the same way that in Gmail, my next few words are anticipated and I can just press tab and have those autofill, I'm going to use Gemini if it's that easy, instead of copying something, pasting it into another tab, finding the right part in the output and pasting it back in. If all that can be handled for me seamlessly, I mean, that's saving me quite a bit of cognitive load.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess we've seen that over the past year is every single thing, every single tool has started integrating AI in one way or another. I think Adobe has been very proactive and impressive in doing that for Photoshop, for instance, where they have more and more cool features. We've seen Notion do it. We've seen, I don't even remember, like every thing you use will have AI in it. It seems like even some things that don't need it, like, it's in Instagram now and it's in Snapchat, these kinds of places. But yeah, it's, to me, I maybe just recently realized this, that this is as big a technological impact on the world, certainly as smartphones. You could argue the internet, where everyone has smartphones now, or most people, right? It changed the way you interact with technology. And now it seems like everyone will use AI. It'll become just part of how you do things, which is interesting to think about for me. And like, we're living through history, and we've had in the past couple of decades like three technological revolutions with the internet and smartphones and now AI. And before that, it was like, computers in microcomputers in the 80s and 70s. So things are interesting. These are interesting times.